Hey folks, and welcome to iWizard. So today I'm going to be talking at long last about the Warrior Prophet. This is book 2 of R. Scott Bakker's The Prince of Nothing series. I've got a lot of thoughts. Stay tuned. All right, welcome back. Jordan here. So again, this is book 2, The Warrior Prophet by R. Scott Bakker. As always, this will be a mostly non-spoiler review. If you haven't had a chance yet to watch my review of book 1, that is The Darkness That Comes Before, feel free to go check that out. I love philosophical fantasy and science fiction, if you didn't know that about me. So I'm trying to take a look here not only at the characters and the writing and the plot in these books, but also to turn an eye toward the big ideas and philosophical themes. So we'll get to my review, but first, a brief synopsis. In The Warrior Prophet, the Holy War ventures further south, and its leaders find themselves embroiled in violence from all sides. Suspicion and doubt mix with political advantage to threaten the timid truce amongst the men of the Tusk. The first battle against the heathen has been won, but while the great names plot and squabble over the spoils, the Dunyan monk and Asarimbor Kellis patiently extends his influence, drawing more and more followers to his banner as he marches southward, not only in prosecution of the Holy War, but to find his father and spread the truth. Kellis' teacher, the sorcerer Drusus Acamian, and his lover Esmenet submit entirely, only to have their faith tested in unimaginable ways, while the warrior Naor Skiotha falls ever deeper into madness. As the crusade paves its way in blood, everyone becomes equal parts victim and villain, especially those caught at its very center. Meanwhile, the skin spies of the consort watch with growing trepidation, and as the vast host of the Holy War endures its sternest test in the searing wastes of the desert, a name, a title, begins to be whispered among the faithful: the Warrior Prophet. But who is the Warrior Prophet? A dangerous heretic who turns brother against brother, or the only man who can avert the second apocalypse? The Holy War stands on a knife's edge. If all is not to be lost, the great powers will have to choose between their most desperate desires and their most ingrained prejudice, between hatred and hope, between the Warrior Prophet and the end of the world. All right, so just a vague synopsis there. Let's get into what I liked about this book. We'll go over what I disliked, and also I have a new segment to share with you guys for the first time that I think I'm going to start doing for every review if it goes over well, but I'll save that for a little bit later. Okay, what I liked. So I want to start by saying that book 2 here is quite different from book 1. In book 1, you have different characters in very different places, many of whom haven't even met each other yet. So I think whether you end up liking book 1 or book 2 more is going really to depend on your taste, on what you tend to like in fantasy. Book 1, again, is spread out. It's devoted mostly to introducing the characters, to giving us a background feel for the world. There's more Game of Thrones style house politics and a bit more backroom Machiavellian scheming and sort of philosophical debate, whereas book 2 is much more tightly focused on one major thing, which is the Holy War, which hasn't even begun yet at the end of book 1. This book is quite literally a long march where you have this gigantic army moving together and sometimes not together in different groups and factions as they travel to meet the Fëanor in battle. And the narrative is actually broken into 3 parts. Part 1 being the first march, part 2 the second, and part 3 the third, obviously. And the cool thing is that each part confronts us with a different sort of large-scale problem that has to be solved. And so some people are going to love that. When this book begins, we know the different players, we know the various factions, we know the different nations and their leaders, and book 2 brings many of those people together and gives them a singular mission. So this book definitely, I would say, felt more focused. Another thing that this book does differently is that it turns the Grimdark up to a level that would have previously seemed unfathomable. Just the general brutality of war, the griminess and sheer filth of a long military march that takes place in a setting that really feels almost pre-medieval. The fact that maybe aside from Kellis, there really are no quote-unquote good guys, really. Everyone's kind of compromised. The characters are all conflicted. When the characters in here are not either rulers, warriors, or generals, they're prostitutes, they're sorcerers, demons, skin spies. And again, this volume turns the Grimdark up to an 11.
One louder.
Why don't you just make 10 louder and make 10 be the top number and make that a little louder?
These go to 11.
What you get here is epic battles, limbs being ripped off, plagues and germ warfare, captures and rescue missions, demons and dungeons and murder dolls, literally incest, rape, torture, duels between sorcerers, horses dying of exhaustion, desperate treks through the desert with no water, right? So, but at the same time, this is also a beautifully written and deeply thematic, poetically rich novel with romantic love and love triangles, non-cringy love triangles, I should say. And you also have bromances and lots of internal reflection. So I guess I'll channel Walt Whitman here and say that this book is large. It contains multitudes. It is not just brutality. In fact, there is comedy at times. And, this isn't like a deeply funny book or anything like that, but you do catch glimpses of Bakker's sense of humor. Sometimes it's around the campfire. There's a great scene actually where Kellis is pretending to be Nayor, and he totally Dana Carvey's this guy with the perfect impression while everyone else is playing along, which is out of Kellis's character. But more often it's just in little moments. There's a hilarious moment where Serway, she's pretty much a beautiful airhead, and she's hanging out with Esmenet as they're traveling, and out of nowhere she just goes, "You're so pretty." And the reader is thinking, oh, wow, that's such a nice compliment. They're exhausted, and here she is, women complimenting women, and then she follows it up with, almost as pretty as me. So you will see some of that, and I would add, to the comedy, there's also love in this book. I found the relationship between Esmenet and Akamian to be both touching and frustrating, and certainly complex. It's one of the most unique and I honestly think realistic relationships in all of fantasy. It feels very modern and true to real life in some sense. These two are in love with one another, but their journey as lovers is both toxic and beautiful at the same time. The nature of their jobs and who they are as people is a major conflict in their relationship. It's the sorcerer spy, and he's got these great powers that he keeps bottled up, and this prostitute. And Akamian just can't seem to get over the fact that Esmenet does this for a living. And I would sympathize with Akamian, but again, it's his choice to be with a prostitute. And so I want to say to the guy, either accept this part of her life or don't. I'm not judging you. I myself could not be with someone like that. But it's like, you are in love with her, dude, and you can't keep holding her job against her. Every time she hurts him, his gut level response is to say, well, what should I have expected? She's just a whore. And, you know, he sometimes treats her like a whore. And then even that gets complicated because of something that happens to Akamian later on in the story that I won't spoil. So that's complex and interesting. But it's not just Akamian. Nayor, once again, is one of the most complex characters in this book. Of course, remember that Nayor, as we talked about last time, is essentially Nietzsche's ideal man. He observes not a herd morality, but a master morality, the warrior morality. He sees life in terms of strength versus weakness rather than good versus evil. At one point in this novel, my gosh, he even says to Proyas, when Proyas asks him, what do you really believe, man? And he says, quote, I believe your ancestors killed my God. I believe your race bears the blood guilt of that crime. And then at one point he says, as if he's like quoting Nietzsche or something like that, in his booming voice, he says, quote, the cravens see folly everywhere. All daring is rash in their eyes because they would call their cowardice prudence. And it's like, geez, that is... Nayor is straight up channeling Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, genealogy of morals, thus spake Zarathustra. So Nayor is like the opposite of Nietzsche's Last Man. He believes that war is conviction. He says this several times in the book, that war is essentially conviction. And this is a disagreement that he has with Confus, with Ikiri Confus, who says, no, war is intellect. And that's one of the perennial debates in this story, is this question of, is the best way to be a soldier, is the best way to win a war, is the best way to utterly defeat your enemy in battle? Is it through sheer will and conviction, or is it a matter of intellect, thinking 10 steps ahead and out-chessing your opponent, right? Nayor obviously believes the former, as I said. In fact, he seems to agree with Akamian when Akamian says, and I'm going to quote him, the intellect is far better at arguing away truths than at finding them. And that definitely connects to what we talked about last time in the big idea segment regarding Jonathan Haidt and David Hume, and what we actually use our intellect for. As Hume says, reason is and ought only to be a slave of the passions. And once you understand that we use our reason as humans primarily to rationalize and defend our gut level intuitions, life does make a hell of a lot more sense once you realize that one fact. And try to remember that Nayor is not just some simpleton. He's not some dumb barbarian. Nayor is an accomplished and immensely talented, an intelligent Skilvendi warrior. But remember, he too has a deeply troubled past. He's been rejected by his own people. His father died at the hands of Kellis's father, whose name is Anasarimbor Moangus. And so he's filled with thoughts of revenge and hatred. And remember, he's the one who saved Kellis from the Srank and saved Serway as well. And so there's definitely a bond there. But I will say that there is something that does, semi-spoiler alert, that does come between these two in the Warrior Prophet, between Kellis and Nayor. And it's definitely something to watch. Another thing I liked here is that we get more of a glimpse of how the magic works in this book. And I may be in the minority here, I'm sure I am, but I'm not a hard magic system guy. I wouldn't say I'm a soft magic system guy either. I just like getting a sense of what type of magic it is, primarily a very brief sketch of how it works. And then I also want to know, what are the consequences of using said magic? And Bakker does this pretty well in this book. The magic was explored a little bit more in this one. We get a taste of the magic of the Scarlet Spires, and we get to see Eleazaris's wrath. We get to see the Kisharam, the sorcerer priests of the Phanem Empire on the battlefield. We get to see Akamian's might as well. Throughout the darkness that comes before, we've gotten the sense that Akamian has great abilities, and he himself has intimated as much. And let me tell you, we find out in this book that yes, in fact, he does. Okay, so I'll just leave it at that. Oh, and I'll add that the Scarlet Spires torture scenes about 3/4 of the way through the book, with the sorcerers torturing, well, I won't say who, but this did remind me a lot of Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun, and how Severian describes the mission of the torturers. It also kind of reminded me, interestingly enough, of Saruman holding Gandalf captive. So that was pretty neat. But just the cool ideas that are really neat, inventive fantasy touches that give Bakker's world so much originality. Stuff like the unmasking room, the Wathi dolls, of course, that we learn more about the consult with the Inkoroi and the Synthes, the dream scenes, the skin spies. All of these details and touches make the world feel like its own thing. And that's another thing in this novel, is that we're learning more about the consult and the threat of the consult, the threat that the Mandate School has been worried about all along. And what the consult thinks of Kellis and what they ultimately want. And I'll just give you a little taste that doesn't really spoil much, but if you're one of those really sensitive, I hate spoilers people, you can close your ears. And I am talking about page 341 as they are talking, the consult, about Kellis. Quote, "The small head tilted backwards. Heavy-lidded eyes watched the wingtips circle and stroke, and circle. Ah, but imagine," and this is the Synthes speaking, by the way, "imagine a world where no womb quickens, where no soul hopes." Sarcellus sucked drool in delight. And so good stuff there. And speaking of, I just wanted to say that I do enjoy Bakker's ability to write compelling fight scenes that are like choreographed almost the way that like John Woo would choreograph a martial arts film. But I also like the way Bakker writes large-scale battles. He writes in a way that's distant and descriptive so that you know what's going on. He sort of writes about the battles, but he also puts you in the battles just enough and adds just enough confusion and chaos and sort of blurry violence that it feels like a real battle. And I just wanted to say that that was really well done in here. Speaking of, I wanted to touch on something that is related to all of this, which is I'm kind of an aesthetics nut. For me, it's not enough for a book to have great characters. It's not enough for a book to have a good plot or sumptuous prose or neat ideas. I really want a book to also have a distinct and compelling aesthetic. The philosopher Thomas Nagel defines consciousness as what it is like to be someone or something. And I would apply that to literature as well. For every book that you read, there should be a certain aesthetic vision that is communicated. It's a sort of what it is like to read that book, and it's something that lingers in the blood, to quote Wordsworth. In other words, if you've ever read a book and then years later found yourself wanting to return to that book, it's often, I would argue, really an aesthetic pull more than anything else. There's a certain qualia that the book you're craving will produce, and that's why you want to read it again. Lord of the Rings, for example, has a very distinct aesthetic that calls to you. It's the rolling hills and fields and pipe smoke and the hobbit holes of the ordered homeland of the Shire with its food and drink and innocence and all of its ordered merriment, right? It's a land of green and brown and yellow. It feels very homey. And then on the other hand, you have other aesthetics within that same book. There's the wizards and the elves with their flowing whites and blues and browns and vanilla clothing and hair and decor. There's a flowing, angelic, ethereal quality about the elves with their songs and their books and their eloquence and all their shimmering magical beauty and soft-spokenness. And then there's the fiery red and black of Mordor with lava flowing and slavering orcs and forges of doom bellowing over, this scarred, pockmarked land. Anyhow, my point is that when you find yourself wanting to read that book, what you're really, in some sense, craving is a sort of nostos, a sort of return to that aesthetic which is unmistakable and vivid. There's something that it feels like to read Lord of the Rings, or a book like Night Circus by Aaron Morgenstern. This book has one of the most distinct and memorable aesthetic foundations of any book that I've ever read. And I want to say that's very true of this book, and I'm learning of this whole series. And you can create a compelling aesthetic with setting, with the names that you use for places and people, with your diction, and just a little bit of linguistic awareness. Tolkien, for instance, used Saxon words and then based like the Elvish languages on Finnish and Welsh. For the Mannish languages, he used mostly Pan-Germanic languages. For the Khuzdul language of the dwarves, he used Hebrew, for example. So my point is that in this book, the places, the people, and the imagery and the level of technology and the clothing and the speech and cultural practices, all of these things give the Prince of Nothing series an aesthetic that is, in my opinion, very biblical in nature. And that's highly unique in fantasy. This series really does have the feel almost like it's set in the very lands of the Bible. Egypt, Canaan, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, Lebanon, Greece, Babylon. There's a very similar feel and sense of life. And I'm thinking Bakker did this on purpose because, as you know, this is the story of a holy war and a prophet, or a Messiah, whatever you want to call him. Kellis is the story's Christ figure, clearly. But at the same time, this series has got the melodrama and the intensity and violence and the conflicts between love and duty and honor that you see in like old samurai films as well, or even the Chinese wuxia films, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, that sort of thing. The dialogue and the themes here actually, to me, gave this particular book the feel of like a Kurosawa film. Throne of Blood, Seventh Samurai, maybe something like Rashomon with the sexual violence and stuff like that. Anyhow, another thing I really enjoyed about this was that it was fascinating to watch Kellis become the chosen one before our eyes. And again, Bakker must have done his research on this period of ancient history where you have these religious revolutions and these organic cults and movements and disciples and just all of that. I found it so enriching to experience this kind of religious blossoming in a fantasy novel, especially because everything we know about these narratives where you have Socrates teaching in Athens and being executed by the state, you have Siddhartha Gautama becoming the Buddha and leaving his home to find enlightenment, you have Christ spreading his message across Judea and amassing followers and performing these miracles, walking on water and feeding the poor, or Muhammad or Zoroaster. I just feel like everything we know about all of these stories about these religious prophets is very distant and secondhand. And one of the things I love about this book is the compelling presentation of a Christ-like figure up close. So up close, in fact, that you're in his head. And this is something Bakker got a lot of flack. I've read a lot of reviews, and many people have said that this is one of the things he doesn't do well, is show Kellis's development and show how he could become this great prophet figure and amass all of these followers. I feel like it's done very well, especially when you're forced to write this kind of thing up close. We're in his head. We're watching him become this sort of wise Socrates figure, pretending that he's the student, right, as Kellis does, in order to question accepted orthodoxies, leaving people in aporia, revealing the truth. And so we're watching Kellis give to the needy and give sermons, and in some cases perform what look to be miracles, the miracle in the desert. We're watching devoted followers flock to him. And I'll just share a couple of passages here with you. This is on page 351. Okay, through 352. Returning to the Conrayan encampment was far less difficult than she feared. Proyas had pitched camp beyond the high walls of Amygnotus, the only great city on the south bank. Because of this, they found themselves part of a great stream of market-bound traffic, bands of horsemen, wains, barefooted penitents, all crowding to the side of the road where the shade of palms was deepest. But rather than vanishing into the crowd, they found themselves beset by people, mostly men of the tusk, but some camp followers as well, all begging to be touched or blessed by the warrior prophet. Word of his stand against the Kirgui, Sarway explained, had further confirmed him in the hearts of many people. They were fairly mobbed by the time they reached the camp. He no longer rebukes them, Esmenet said, watching in astonishment. Sarway laughed. Isn't it wonderful? And it was. It was. There was Kellis, the man who had teased her so many times about their fire, walking among the adoring masses, smiling, touching cheeks, uttering warm and encouraging words. There was Kellis, the warrior prophet. He looked up to them, grinned and winked, pressed against the girl's back in the saddle. Esmenet could feel Sarway shiver in delight, and for an instant she experienced a pang of savage jealousy. Why did she always lose? Why did the gods hate her so? Why not someone else, someone deserving? Why not Sarway? But shame followed hard on these thoughts. Kellis had come for her. Kellis, this man whom others worshipped, had come out of concern for her. And so we're getting a sense of Kellis coming into himself the birth of a prophet. But what I loved about that aspect of the story was that we get to see the fact that not everyone is going to support him. There are going to be feuds. Not everyone believes that Kellis is the real deal. Yes, there's going to be his tens of thousands of supporters, the Zaudinyani, or however you pronounce it, who, speaking of the darkness that comes before, these people believe that Kellis is the first cause, the prime mover, that which comes before. And then on the other hand, there are going to be the Orthodox, the people who think he's a heretic, the people who believe in Sejanus as being the real prophet. And lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't just touch on the ending. I really liked the final chapter of this book, which is quite enigmatic and really cool and has different characters, let's say, and really makes you want to read on to the third book. And I'll just leave it at that. And so we'll stop there on what I liked. And now for what I didn't like. And it's a short list, guys. One thing is, it's something I mentioned earlier. The plot is very simplistic. Again, it is just a long march from one place to another. Yes, there's side stuff going on. Yes, there are other interesting schemes and plots and battles and scenes of violence and betrayal and all of that stuff. But overall, the plot is less complex than something like you're going to see in the first book or, I don't know, George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones, Song of Ice and Fire. So the plot is very simplistic. Another thing I would say is that the action and the weird sex stuff can be gratuitous at times and almost like the stuff of comic books. And I don't want to pile on. I know Bakker gets a lot of criticism for his treatment of women, and you'll notice that none of these people ever are complaining about gratuitous violence, only gratuitous men being mean to women in a medieval or pre-medieval setting. And so you could obviously argue that murder is way worse. Murder, torture, all of these things that we regularly see in grimdark fantasy novels, there's plenty of that in here too. But the moment that there's also misogyny and ill treatment of women, that's when people start bringing out their placards. And I'm just one of those people who says, okay, I'm going to be philosophically consistent. This is a bleak, dark, grimdark world full of pain and torture and hell and mayhem and misunderstanding and bad values and patriarchal dominance over women. That's just what it is. That's what our own past looked like. And yes, it's fantasy. And so certainly you could scrub that out because it's fantasy. But again, you never hear these same people making the same sorts of arguments about things that are equally as bad as this cruelty towards women. None of them are holding up placards that say, get rid of violence in fantasy. So many people have been beheaded and killed and hung on pikes and crucified and all of this. Okay, well, I want to see you be philosophically consistent. If it's inappropriate to put cruelty towards women in a fantasy novel, certainly murder and torture is even worse. So maybe like you just be philosophically consistent and argue that you want your world to be sanitized. You want your fantasy world to be a safe space. I don't. I enjoyed this book and I understand why Bakker wrote it the way that he did, but I would say that the weird sex stuff, it does get cringy. The sex scenes are extremely cringy. You'll see what I mean when you dive into it. I kind of don't want to go there. I don't want to get demonetized. And I guess I would say my last criticism is about 3/4 of the way through the book zooms out and becomes, I guess, a lot of exposition. You're in the characters' heads, you're feeling what they're feeling, and then suddenly about 3/4 of the way through the book, there's a kind of zooming back, and it feels like Bakker is kind of speeding through the important events. All right, and that brings us to a new segment that I'm going to do. I'll keep this really brief. As we move forward here with the books that I review, I'm going to choose music that I think could accompany your reading. Whether the music kind of ties into the aesthetic, whether it seems like it would be good soundtrack music to whatever book I'm reading. So for this book, I want to choose one band that I think just so obviously goes along with the aesthetic, the themes, the ideas, the writing, the violence, the madness, all of that. And that is, when you're reading this book, I think you should listen to Tool. And I got this idea from one of my listeners. He was watching my review of Redemption Arc by Alistair Reynolds, and he recommended that I listen to Nine Inch Nails the next time I read Revelation Space or Redemption Arc. And I thought, what a cool idea. I'm going to start recommending music for each of the books that I review. I never recommended one for the first book in this series, but I guess for The Darkness That Comes Before, I would retroactively go back and recommend Andrew Bird. Andrew Bird's album Armchair Apocrypha, which has many themes of the apocalypse and empires, and I just think that would pair really nicely with book one. Okay, so for now, that's going to be all. I'm going to wrap it up. Thanks for watching. Please follow us on Facebook, on Goodreads, on Instagram. Feel free to tip your starving booktuber via Patreon. And until next time, happy reading.